That I'm an apprentice gunsmith, so making these is actually part of my job. My favorite weapon, I gotta say, is this. This right here is called a blunderbuss. And this right here will throw 2 ounces of shot towards the enemy. It won't throw it far, but it's gonna do a lot of hurt to a lot of people. Problem is, this thing kicks like a mule. It's like holding a cannon to your shoulder. And yes, I helped make this with my master. Now, to make the guns, you've got actually several different people that make different parts. You've got the barrel maker, you have the lock maker, and then you have the final gunsmith who assembles everything. Now, I've learned how to make all of these from scratch. This one right here, this is actually a child's gun that I helped make, and every single part on this is handmade in the shop. We made the barrel. The barrel's forged out of a flat piece of iron. It's welded into a tube slowly. After that, it's reamed out with a long bore. We didn't have any power tools except for me cranking on the hand wheel over and over and over for days, it seemed like, because I'm the apprentice, I'm the horsepower for my master. Then we rifled the barrel. The rifling machine's a little bit challenging to describe right now, but I can give some references for Mrs. Jan if you guys want for later on how the stuff's made. The lock right here is made of several different pieces, and they're all hand forged and filed and hardened. And this right here takes a couple weeks of hard work to make. It has to be fine tuned. There's a trigger, and then all this has to be, the wood for the stock has to be carved out around it. And then we get into fancy stuff, doing some carving on it. The nose cap on this is poured pewter, so it's molten metal that's poured into a little mold. And then we drill some final holes and take it out to the range, put in a really big load to proof it, tie it to a stump, and stand behind a tree, pull the string, and hopefully it doesn't explode. We're lucky so far, knock on wood. But that's how we filled the muskets and the rifles. And my favorite one is the blunderbuss. Second question, how many layers would a soldier wear? Well, right now, I'm dressed pretty normal for at least a militiaman. I've got on my knee breeches, my socks that go up to my knees, held up. I'm wearing a shirt. I'm wearing a wool waistcoat. It's a type of vest. And a jacket over that. And even during the summer, this was what was typically worn. I've got a few different uniforms hanging up here that are made out of wool. I've got an American uniform, a British uniform, and then a civilian coat hanging up over there. So those would be worn, and then it was always customary to wear a hat outside. So it was really hot, lots of water had to be drinking, or other things. Water was suspect, they didn't understand germs at the time. Yeah. I'll get to that. Keep that question. It's a good question. At the time, water was suspect. They didn't really understand microbes and stuff. They just knew that you got sick sometimes from drinking water. So they drank a lot of beer and a lot of cider. Even kids your age will drink beer. Now, it wasn't the type of beer that you may have seen your dad or mom drink or other people. It was much lighter in character, but it had been boiled in the process, and they didn't realize at the time that's what killed all the bugs in the beer. Let's see, so lots and lots of hydration. What was the most common food to eat? Good question. I could actually spend all day talking about food. I love the food and cooking of the time. But there was no refrigeration except during the winter on ice, so things were very seasonal. It was what was in season. Apples were a rare treat come springtime unless they've been dried during the fall. Stuff that like salads, you could only have in the springtime, you couldn't have in the summer or in the fall. So a lot of meats, a lot of cheeses, and a lot of bread was the main part of the diet. Now the only preservation they really had was freezing it, but that would only be for a few months, or salting it and drying. And so lots of salt meat, salt fish, salt this, salt that, dried biscuits, kind of bland. but I do like the food at the time. Most everything was fresh. Let's see, next one. What was the most used weapon? That's a great question. The most common used weapon during the war was this right here. This is a Brown Bess musket. This was the British musket and what took over most of the known world. It's a 75 caliber smooth bore musket. So there's no rifling in it. It's kind of like a shotgun and would typically shoot one big round ball out of it instead of a bunch of shot like a shotgun. But it could be used like a shotgun. And as you can see, it's quite tall. And then this coupled with the bayonet made for an extremely fearsome combination because these things were slow to load and fire. Average expected rate of fire for a good drilled British soldier was 3 shots a minute. Can you imagine going out to the range and shooting 3 shots a minute? That'd get pretty darn boring. However, when it's coming your way, that's coming awfully darn fast. The other thing is, how fast can you run in a minute? It means that the other enemy could only fire 3 times in that 1 minute, and you could probably run pretty far. So, with the added of the bayonet, we now have a spear. So when they get close, well, I can't exactly shoot them from here very easily, but I can stab them like a spear. And part of that will come into another question that somebody had about lining up. We'll get into that in a bit. So the bayonet charge won the battle several times for the British. It was a long time before the Americans were disciplined enough to stand and fight against it. Now, as a rifleman myself, I don't have a bayonet because I'm shooting something like this, and I can't really put a bayonet on this. So that's why I've got my trusty axe with me and knife. So I've got my rifleman's knife. So if it comes down to hand-to-hand combat, I get underneath the bayonet and I go for the kill with the enemy soldiers. It was very brutal and very bloody. Next question. I like this one. Were there sweets back then? Oh yeah, there were sweets. Not much of what we think of as confections and candy, but there were sweets back then. One of my favorite ones is candied flowers. During the springtime, there's certain flowers that are edible, and you would take and paint them with a little bit of egg white, and then sprinkle some sugar on them, let them dry, and they were absolutely fantastic. There was also things that were made like gingerbreads, would be made throughout the year, and some other things. And on a rare occasion, could get some actual stretched candy like a taffy or black licorice or something like that. So there were sweets, and then the really yummy one of all, chocolate. What type of sports did they do back then? Great question. Not a lot of what we think of as sports. Football didn't exist. Soccer was in its infancy. Baseball didn't exist. Basketball didn't exist. But they did have cricket. Anybody here heard of cricket before? Yeah. Which was kind of evolved into American baseball. So they had cricket. That was one of the few team sports, but they didn't have teams. They didn't have the Boston Whackers or the New York Pitchers or anything like that. It would just be a group of people would get together and play it communally. Other sports that they did, boxing. And it was without gloves, it was bare knuckle boxing. They did racing, horse races, gambling or playing cards. Not a lot of what we think of today. They would have shooting competitions, a lot, or hunting competitions. So those were the sports of the time. Let's see, how did people fish back then? I like that one. Fishing for recreation was not really a thing except for the upper crust of society. And because of rules of gentry, fishing reels, they had been kind of invented, but they were considered a poacher's tool. So it was a string on a stick and hiding behind a bush trying to catch a fish, or maybe with a hand line. Anybody ever fish with a hand line? where you just take the line with your hook and bait, throw it out there, and you've got a stick or a bobbin or your hand to wind the line around. And then the other way is a lot of fishing. In fact, the vast majority was with a net. So nets would be set up on rivers or out in the ocean, and they would catch fish that way. But for recreation, not so much. There was a very small group of what would become fly fishing, but they were gentlemen that would go out and do that, and it was always catch and release. It's its own subject that's kind of interesting that I've got some books on. Let's see, what was the most destructive weapon used? That's a good question. Any ideas?
A blunderbuss?
Blunderbuss? That was a very destructive weapon, but not the most. What about you? Now, as for a hand weapon, okay?
A cannon?
A cannon, and there's a specific type of cannon. You have it?
I was gonna say what she said.
She beat you to it. Okay, so cannons were the most destructive weapons. There was two things. There was the mortar, and we're talking a cannon that's about that big around that would shoot an explosive shell that would lob it up and over, and that shell was filled with gunpowder. Had a long fuse on there and a wooden plug, and it would light off as they're shooting it up, and it would land inside of a fort and then explode, sending shrapnel out like a giant grenade. Or the absolute most destructive weapon of the time period isn't what most of us would think of as a weapon. It was a ship. HMS Victory was a British ship of the line, and it had cannons on several decks, and it would shoot a broadside. So one side of the ship would all shoot at once. One broadside from the HMS Victory had more firepower than all of George Washington's cannons put together for his artillery. And that ship actually still exists. That's over in England, and even though it was on the enemy side, it's still really neat. Okay, were health standards horrible? Did a lot of people die from sickness? Oh, absolutely. Compared to modern times, the health standards of it, there weren't none. If you went in to have surgery, first off, we didn't have elective surgery back then, so it was usually to have something cut off. Like my leg had been shot, well, they're not gonna fix my leg, they're just gonna cut it off. They wouldn't even bother washing their hands. They might be using bloody rags from other people, and it was just disgusting and red infection. They didn't have antibiotics at the time. They knew nothing about it. They didn't know about cleanliness. They didn't know about using alcohol to sterilize things. They had no idea what microbes were because they didn't have the microscope at the time. The most casualties, and we'll get into this on another question, from the war were from sickness. More people died of infection and malnutrition than they did from actually on the battlefield from wounds. So absolutely horrible. People might bathe once a month. It wasn't the whole thing that they were afraid to bathe, it just wasn't considered important. And I can imagine that it smelled really funky at that time period. And going into this one, this is one of those funner questions. What was toilet paper like? And I'm sure that Mrs. Jan, when she read that question, just kind of rolled her eyes. I like this question. Toilet paper wasn't really a thing. It didn't mean that when people were done using the loo that they didn't wipe, but they used corn cobs, grass, moss, rags, or rocks, sticks, or my favorite one, seashells. It just doesn't sound comfortable. So I mean, they did clean up after themselves, but it wasn't with the modern standard that we have now. It was just whatever was handy, especially in farm communities, corn cobs. They would actually keep those throughout the year just for using in the outhouses. Yeah.
No.
Let's see. This one, I love this question. And whoever it is, I'm not making fun of you, I just like the way it's phrased. Why did they use old guns? So, these are old guns, right? So I have a question for you now. I want you to think in slightly different terms. Were they old 200 years ago?
No.
No. So right now, who here has a PlayStation 5? Who here has an Xbox? So, are you guys using the Xbox 11?
No.
No, it doesn't exist yet. Playing the PlayStation 7? Who here has an iPhone 20? They don't exist yet. Just like modern guns don't exist now, so they were using what we consider old-fashioned. That's what they had. That was state of the art at the time. It was new at the time. So that's why they were using that. It wasn't until many years later that cartridge guns were invented and then well, they did have some actual repeating guns, but they were still cumbersome, expensive to make, and not reliable. But won't get into that too much. So, not trying to make fun of you, I just thought it was a fun question. This is a good one. How many people died? I'm assuming during the Revolution. And I actually have to take my glasses off to read my answer because I had to look this one up. So, estimates are between 25,000 and 70,000 casualties during the war. Now, of those, about 6,800 people actually died in battle from shot, from swords, from tripping and breaking a leg and bashing their head in, actually died in the war. The rest died of disease, died of infection, and a large portion of those, about 17,000, died as prisoners of war on British prison ships in New York Harbor. So what the British did is they took a bunch of old ships that they had captured or they determined weren't good enough for fighting, took the mast off, took the cannons off, and made floating prisons in New York Harbor. And at least 17,000 Americans died on those ships. It's actually pretty brutal when you think about it. If you were sent to one of those ships, it was almost like a death sentence. All right, let's see. This is a long question. My arms aren't quite long enough. If guns back then had low accuracy and they lined up to shoot, why weren't they more careful about getting shot? It's a good question. Why did they just walk into enemy fire? Were they even afraid to die? We'll start with the last part. Yes, they were very afraid to die. However, they thought that what they were doing was more important than their life. And that's actually a brave thing to think of the institution of the United States of America as opposed to a British colony. To think that my life is worth preserving this for my children and my children's children to break away from the tyranny that was at the time of King George. Now, as for lining up in the battle, first off, it was considered cowardly to hide and shoot. What we consider guerrilla warfare now, or standard warfare, where you don't just stand out and shoot at the enemy. You hide behind rocks, you hide behind trees and stuff. That was considered cowardly at the time by the noblemen, by the upper crust of society. And a lot of the techniques that we have with everybody lining up came from wars past, even before guns, because they would line up with pikes, with spears, and those same formations. Yeah.
Like a shield wall?
Like a shield wall, exactly. But then the advent of the gun came in, and the techniques didn't really change. So they would still line up and shoot each other, and your neighbor would get hit, your best friend. And the thing is, part of it was instilling discipline, that the soldier was more afraid of his sergeant behind him than he was of the enemy in front of him. So, especially on the British, if they broke ranks, if they feared for anything and ran away, they would be executed. That was it. They would be hung as cowards. And it was better to die as a soldier brave than to die as a coward being hung. Now, eventually, the Americans did start adopting techniques where they wouldn't just stand up in line and shoot. They would be in the trees. They would be fighting Indian style. And it did prove to be successful and eventually helped to win the war. But Yeah, I always look at that with armies lined up at each other, and they're hundreds of yards away, maybe out of range, at least of the muskets, not necessarily the cannon. And it takes a lot of bravery to do that, and a lot of do what you're told. All right, how did people talk back then? Did they have accents or dialects? Actually, they did. And you'd be able to understand them, but you would think you were talking to a British citizen. They had essentially a clean British accent, but it was across the entire US on the seaboard that they didn't have regional dialects yet as we know it. So you didn't have the people down in the south with a southern drawl. You didn't have people in Appalachia or things like that, or a Boston accent. Everybody had pretty much the same. There were some small regional stuff starting to occur at the time, and now it's really blossomed where you can tell, especially from people on the East Coast, typically where they're from by how they talk. But at the time, they'll just kind of had a generic British Cockney accent, if you will. Okay, this one, I had to think a lot about this one. What is the most valued American artifact? Any ideas in class? No? Yeah.
Declaration of Independence.
That's a great one. And actually, that's probably there at the top. As for artifacts from the war, there's a uniform from, let's see, what was it? Oh, I thought I wrote that down. Oh, there we go. Lieutenant Tench Tillman. His uniform is one of 3 surviving officers' uniforms from the Revolution. He presented George Washington's report to Congress about the British surrender at Yorktown. So this was him going to Congress telling about that we just won it. And it's one of 3 uniforms, officer uniforms, that are in existence. Now, one of the things to think about uniforms, you wouldn't really think of that as a really valuable relic, but there's so few of them. Because when the soldiers went home, they kept their uniforms and they wore them and recut them and retailored them, and they eventually wore out. Fabric at the time was extremely valuable. It was hard to make, and so they used what they had. All the uniforms, or most of them, wore out, rotted away. Nobody really thought much to keep them. I mean, how many of you have family members that have been in the military? Do you still have any of their uniforms? Probably not. They may have gone to Goodwill. I've still got a couple of my uniforms, but after a generation or so, do any of you have your grandfather's uniform or great grandfather's? You do? That's actually pretty cool. But most of them go away, and they just like our clothes that we're wearing today, they'll eventually end up at Goodwill or a yard sale, maybe used as a rag, and unfortunately, probably turned into a trash heap somewhere. It's a sad reality. Same thing back then. Not a lot survives. Now, there are a few other cool things that exist. There's a pair of pistols from the first day of the Revolution. Major Pitcairn's pistols. Major Pitcairn was a British officer, and he was in charge of the soldiers, the British soldiers at Lexington, which was considered the spark of the Revolution. He dropped his pistols. They were picked up later on and auctioned off, and they still exist in the Smithsonian. And they're a beautiful pair of Scottish steel frame pistols that are very nicely engraved. So that's one of the cool things that still exist. And there's actually another question about artifacts that I'll get into. There's another really, really cool one I'll talk about. Next question is, what is gunpowder made of? I'm not going to give you any recipes. Don't want you going in and blowing your fingers off. But it's made of 3 basic components. It's made of charcoal, it's made of brimstone, and saltpeter. What those actually are, I'm not going to tell you because what the modern terms are. But it's those 3 in a very simple formula. Do not try to make it at home. Things go really bad when people try to make it. But it was out there to make. I will say, saltpeter though, how they made it or collected it, rather disgusting. Yeah.
Did they use urine?
Yes, they did. They had people called night soilmen. Chamber pots, if you will. The contents of that was considered night soil. And they had people that would collect that. And then they would take the urine and put it over straw and let it ferment, and then as it dried, crystals would grow. And that's one of the ways they collected saltpeter. So if any of you are really curious and interested, don't try it, your parents are gonna hate it. Okay, last question that you guys did. Do we have any artifacts related to the Sons of Liberty? So I mentioned earlier that we were gonna talk about another type of artifact or another one that exists. This one is, in my opinion, really interesting. However, if you were at a museum, you'd probably see it and walk right past it, not giving it a second thought. So the Sons of Liberty met underneath what they call the Liberty Tree. In a museum that's actually the Sons of Liberty Museum, they have roots from that tree that are bundled together. And it doesn't really, it's not attractive, it's just some tree roots. But what they represent, I think, is fantastic. But that's one of the few artifacts that can be documented to the Sons of Liberty. There's lots of things about the ideals of them. There's things from their families and descendants, but the roots were the only thing I could find that really is related to the Sons of Liberty. So, I think all the questions that you guys presented were fantastic, and I loved them. They made me think about some of the different things, and actually I had to look some of these up. Some of them I knew off the top of my head, but I had to look some up. Now, knocking stuff over. Before I go too far and forget, I had a question about this silver piece on the British uniform. This is called a gorget. This was essentially a badge of rank, and this would designate that the person wearing this uniform was a officer in the British Army. And the gorget is the last remnant of the suits of armor. So, you think in the knights of old time in their big suits of armor, the neck plate right here was called a gorget. And as the armor kind of went away with the invention of the gun, that was the one piece that stayed on that became just a badge and shrank down to what you see there. And the casting on this, let me take this over so it's easier to see. Right here in the center, you've got a lion and a unicorn and a big shield. This is the British coat of arms. So this was the symbol for Great Britain at the time. Actually, it's still used to this day. I thought I saw questions. Hand go up. Okay, maybe I didn't. All right, how are we doing on time?
You have about 12 minutes.
About 12 minutes. So, let's talk about the fun stuff up here on the table. I know everybody's been looking at this stuff with like, ooh, what's that, what's that, what's that? So we're gonna start off with the blunderbuss. So, I actually did help make this. I am in fact a amateur gunsmith, and I'm learning to make these with a couple of master smiths. And this was made by my good friend Bob Quick. So, this right here is very effective. You could load essentially a handful of shot, of gravel, nails, broken glass, whatever you have at hand, and put it onto a good amount of powder. Brace yourself, because it's going to kick like a mule, and in fact this has put a couple people on their backside, and kind of point in the general direction and pull the trigger. This flare up here is not actually to spread the shot, contrary to popular belief. This is for provide a funnel for loading. So I've got a handful of gravel. Instead of trying to get it down a small barrel, I've just got a big funnel. I throw it down that, give this thing a thump on the ground, and I'm ready to go. So this thing could be shot quite quickly. Yeah.
Does it still work?
Absolutely does. Yeah, I shot this year. I was trying to think if I had it or not. Now, these guns are made of 3 components. I'm sure you've heard this term before, lock, stock, and barrel. Who's heard that before? This right here is the lock, this is the stock, this is the barrel, and that's where it comes from. And then these are all flint locks. Have you guys heard that term? What a flint lock is here in the jaw is an actual piece of flint rock, as opposed to a percussion cap, because they hadn't been invented yet, or other forms of ignition. They were more reliable than the predecessors, the match lock or the wheel lock. And how these things work is this piece right here called the frizzen. You close it down, this is a piece of hardened steel. You pull back the hammer to full cock, it was on half cock, also where the term don't go off half cock comes from. And then when you pull the trigger, and yes, I checked that this is unloaded and pointing in a safe direction, it creates a spark, and that spark is going to travel into the barrel through a hole. That spark is going to ignite some black powder that's in the pan, be a big poof. It'll travel a spark through the hole into the main charge of the gun, and then set that off, shooting it downrange. And there is a little bit of a delay. So who here shoots on a regular basis or goes out shooting with their parents or something like that? Awesome. Modern gun, you pull the trigger, instant bang. This one, pull the trigger, clash, boom, bang, and there's a bit of a hang. Yeah.
When does the actual like knockback happen? After like when the shot comes out of the barrel, or when it goes in when the shot goes in the barrel?
As the shot's coming out the barrel. Goes back to physics. Who's here's heard of for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction? So the amount of energy going downrange is also coming back into your shoulder, but in a much bigger place than that tiny little bullet. Yes?
How loud would it have been?
Very, very loud. I made the mistake of shooting this without hearing protection one time, and I can't hear for beans anymore. It wasn't only because of this, but it is extremely loud. Has anybody set off a mortar on the 4th of July with your parents? It's like that going off and being right next to it.
Unless there were probably like 3 of them going off at once.
If there was 3 of them going off at once, oh yeah, very, very loud.
Do people ever like break their shoulders, like, or hurt themselves like badly using it?
If it's loaded correctly, no. However, if this or even the Brown Bess is double loaded, which is possible, and I'll explain that in a moment, then there can be enough that it could break a shoulder, definitely bruise it.
Did people have earplugs back then?
They did not. Now, some of the people shooting cannons and stuff might stuff rags in their ears because they understood it was loud, but the thought of hearing protection, not really a case. Let me talk real quick about double loading. So, Brown Bess, you're lined up, you're ordered in the line on loading. It's not just fire at will. So you've got a pre-made cartridge, which is just a paper tube filled with gunpowder and a bullet. You bite off the end of the paper, you prime the pan, close the pan, take the rest of the powder, pour it down the barrel, put the ball and paper in there, pull up the ramrod, drive it down, put your ramrod back, and this is all to a cadence. Pull up, present, fire, and then you do it again. Well, if you've got 100 or 200 soldiers all firing at once, first off, you're probably not actually aiming, you're just pointing in the general direction of the blue coats on the other side. And if it doesn't go off, you may not know it because of all the chaos. And then I'm gonna go up there and I'm gonna load again. May not go off again. And I'm gonna load again. And so now I have 3 loads all stacked up in here. Now it finally goes off. And I'm shooting out a massive triple load out of this thing. I might get a broken shoulder, I might get knocked on my butt, or this might actually explode. And that did happen. So these were hazardous to the user as well as to the recipient. More hazardous to the recipient though. And actually, well, I've got this one. This is a Brown Bess. This is a smooth bore musket, and this is what the British use. This is considered a shortland Brown Bess. During the French and Indian War, they had a similar one that was called the longland Brown Bess that was another 6 inches taller. Making these barrels was expensive, so they determined that they could shorten them by about 6 inches, make them a little bit cheaper to make. Because when you're making hundreds or thousands of them, it adds up. Yeah.
What's this?
It's called a patch box. I'll talk about that in a moment. So the Brown Bess, fitted with a bayonet lug and fit for a bayonet, was a very, very deadly weapon. The Americans used the Charleville musket, which was a French musket, slightly smaller bore, but they had a lot of these that they had captured, because if you win a battle, you're not just going to leave these laying there or throw them away. You're going to adopt these into your arms and into your army, because these were very expensive, and the American army was very poor. We were begging for money from France and from other countries. I guess the modern analogy now would be Ukraine asking the U.S. and other countries to help support it. So they're fighting invasion, but also fighting for their independence now. So let me bring up this one. Got a good question about this piece right here. This is called a patch box. This is, you only really see it on rifles, and it's a removable lid, and you have a little box in here that you could keep cleaning patches, shooting patches, or cleaning gear in. And it's mostly just a decorative, stylistic thing, but it was started off in Germany and became a trademark for American guns. In fact, I'll show you what this evolved into. I have this really nice, fancy rifle right here, and this has a brass patch box that's engraved, and the wooden patch box evolved into this. And this right here is considered a uniquely American type style of art. This one's really fancy. This was made by my good friend Alan for my dad. And all of the metal work on this, all the brass, everything's handmade, hand engraved. A lot of work on this one. It's a very small caliber. It's about 40 caliber. We call this a squirrel gun, and would be for hunting squirrels or rabbits or things like that. Not really useful on the battlefield compared to a musket, because a 40 caliber ball is less than half an inch, about the size of a pencil in diameter, as opposed to a musket ball right here that's 3/4 of an inch, and it is massive. It weighs 1/11 of a pound. There was 11 of these to a pound, as opposed to this one, which would probably have about 30 to the pound, just to give you an idea. Let's see, some other things. Told you about my axe here briefly. Another thing that I may have, especially around the Indians, we have a pipe hawk or pipe tomahawk. And these were used for trade with the Indians, and yes, it's actual functional pipe, but it's also a very devastating weapon used in war. I've actually got a couple of items here that are Indian influence. I've got the pipe tomahawk, and I have the knife sheath here with quill work. So the work on here, the embroidery, is made out of porcupine quills that have been dyed. And then a very common scalping knife that the Indians would use. The Indians typically during the Revolution were aligned with the British, with the exception of the Delaware tribe. Yes?
My dad has a knife like that.
Very cool. I've got a couple, and I like this pattern. This right here is an Indian scalper, or I have my rifleman's knife here on my belt. Very similar pattern, and this is my utilitarian knife. I can eat with it, I can butcher out an animal with it, I can pick my teeth with it, whatever the case may be. As a rifleman, I'm also equipped with a powder horn and bullet bag, because loading a rifle takes a little bit longer than the musket. I told you the musket has the pre-made cartridges. 3 rounds a minute was the average. As a rifleman, maybe 1 round a minute, 1 round every 2 minutes. So I was at a disadvantage on that, on how many bullets I could get downrange, but had much higher accuracy. I was the sniper of the time. So there was a lot of officers that, especially on the British, they hated riflemen. And they actually had a bounty out on people like me, and would pay several shillings for me being killed. So I was at a disadvantage. We were called widowmakers for good reason. A few other things I have up here. I've got I was somewhat educated being a gunsmith, so I kept a journal, and then this right here is my little pocket inkwell. and feather pen. And it's not like Harry Potter with the big fancy stuff. I just trim it down to the feather that's needed. And I would dip that in and keep notes in my journals, what was going on, maybe write letters home. And then at the end of the day, I could put that in my pocket and carry on and not make a mess. Cooking, we didn't have cast iron, that was just too heavy to carry on the trail. So I had a sheet pot tin, sheet metal tin, pan. And this right here, I would use with my mess. My mess was myself and 4 other soldiers. And so this was our lone cooking implement. If we wanted to roast meat, we might be putting it on a stick, but otherwise we were putting it in the pot and boiling it, which was pretty much everything. Whatever our rations were, we put in here and boil. We might get rice one day, we might get dried peas another. If we were lucky, we'd get a little bit of salt pork or beef. Our rations were nothing to write home about. Right here, this is a little container made out of part of a cow's horn. This is called a salt horn. So in here, I've actually got a little bit of salt in there, and salt was very valuable. It was the only real seasoning as a soldier I might expect to have. So I had that, and it was near and dear to me. If I was bored in the evening, I might take a needle and scratch a design, rub a little ink into it called scrimshaw, and decorate it up.
How would you get cow's horn?
Cow's horn? Well, we've got to butcher the cows out for cooking, for getting the beef, and we would take the horns off of the head. It was actually a very common commodity at the time. It was the equivalent of plastic, because it could be heated up and molded. I've got a spoon made from cow's horn. I've got a gunpowder horn on the side. It was a very, very utilitarian item that was well used. Got a wallet up here with some different money at the time. I've got a mold for making musket balls. I would melt lead over the fire. I've got a little ladle here that I can put a stick in because this would be too hot to hold. And I can cut up my bars of lead, put in there, melt it up, and once it's molten, take and pour a little bit of that into the mold. Once that cools, pop it out, and it's got a little button on it, and then back here at the bottom are a pair of cutters, kind of like wire cutters. Cut the button off, remelt the button, and now I've got a bullet mold, or a bullet made up. Very slow process, but there was a lot of downtime. There wasn't battles every day. And so the soldiers would be tasked with making bullets between the battles. Fire starting kit. They didn't have lighters, they didn't have matches at the time. So I would use something very similar to what's on the guns. And I've got a piece of hardened steel, piece of flint, and the sparks, and I catch that in a piece of charred cloth. Blow that into life with a, what we call a bird's nest. It's actually just some tinder. And make our fires that way.
Okay, guys. Can you guys tell Mr. Reeve thank you so much for his time here today?
Thank you.